Well, joining us now in the studio is international affairs analyst Dan Perry and public diplomacy advisor Jonathan El-Khouri. All right, let's start with the question that is on everybody's minds. I think that we all know that, the decision that is made today by the American voters is going to have a long-standing impact on the future of the war that we're seeing right now between Israel and the axis of resistance. But if Trump wins the election, how can we expect his policy in the Middle East to impact the ongoing fighting that we're seeing?
The Democrats have been rather acquiescent to disobedience on the part of almost every player involved in this conflict. They have a very grand and great design that they would like to see happen. Israel stands in the way of part of it. Certainly Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran stand in the way of much of it. The idea, I think, is that Trump, should he win, being capricious and impatient and a little bit inclined to simple narratives, might just step in with a hammer and break apart this edifice of pointlessness that we are seeing here for the past year and a half. He might go to Iran and do the very thing that I've been calling for, but which I cannot see Kamala doing, which is to lay down the law and say no more proxies, no more nuclear. Not a matter of deals. We will come after you if you don't start behaving. I could see that happening.
But during his leadership, obviously, Iran remained active. It
continued because on the other hand, he's an isolationist and he doesn't want more misadventures, and it didn't seem as urgent back then. And he had a win from his perspective, which I think was a terrible mistake. His win was to walk out of the nuclear deal, and he was kind of done with Iran. Right now, the win would be to put an end to the madness in the Middle East. Now, Israelis think that he's going to be forever acquiescent to the current Israeli government, and that's why we see all this support for Trump in Israel. But they may be in for a surprise, because whereas Trump doesn't care about the Palestinians, doesn't care about humanitarian issues, he also doesn't like to look like a loser who is allowing his allies to do a forever war. He hates forever wars. People talk about how Biden abandoned Afghanistan. No, Biden implemented awkwardly Trump's abandonment of Afghanistan. Trump basically surrendered to the Taliban because they wanted to end that war. Something similar could happen here. In short, Harris's continuity, Trump could be a surprise.
Now, it's interesting because we see so many kind of Western liberal progressive voters in the United States, for example, essentially saying that Harris is the only option for us when it comes to securing a path forward for perhaps a Palestinian state, or really just to end the suffering of Gazans right now amidst the war. But we're kind of seeing a very different rhetoric when it comes to Arab voices across the Middle East, specifically in Lebanon. I mean, we just saw some vox pop, some people speaking on the street and basically giving their input as to what they think would happen if Trump were to be elected, and they overwhelmingly seem to be wanting Trump to win this election. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, for my acknowledgement of the Lebanese culture, a lot of them, also like a lot of the Arabs in the U.S., would support Trump because of conservative issues, because of the way that they look at LGBTQ plus issues, because the way that they look about abortion and stuff like that, that Trump already has announced his affiliation towards that. So a lot of these, you can say, conservative communities look at Trump as in a way that, although they don't agree with him 100%, but they really ally themselves with a lot of his thinking.
Obviously, we saw this major push from the Biden administration in the final weeks leading up to this election to implement some type of ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. That obviously has not happened. The question is, would Trump be able to actually make that happen, especially understanding that Israel, for one, does not trust that Hezbollah is going to follow any type of resolution, as it hasn't in the past. Well, we've seen with UN Resolution 1701 as an example.
Well, I think part of what's being missed in all this talk about who might force the parties to do a ceasefire is the actual ideological position on the issues. And I think the U.S. does agree with Israel's goal of basically implementing 1559, which is a disarming of Hezbollah and Lebanon regaining control over its own territory. It's an obvious thing to support. There's almost no counter-argument. I'm sure the Lebanese government supports it. If you hear the Prime Minister Mikati speaking between the lines, you know he supports it. I don't think Trump will walk away from that.
He says it out loud.
Yeah, it's incredible courage, which is a reflection of how Israel has degraded Hezbollah,
Well,
that they're
Trump
getting
might
up the
not
courage.
necessarily walk away from that, but the question is whether or not it can actually be implemented.
For this
right?
to happen,
because
he would have to bring that aforementioned hammer, and that hammer would largely have to go to Iran, and he would have to make clear that the U.S. is putting all its weight behind the implementation of the Security Council resolutions, and Hezbollah, at the very least, I suspect it'll come to that compromise, moving north of the Litani River and agreeing to never again deploy near the border, and having there be a Western-backed version of the Lebanese army on the border. Things of this nature, I can see it happening, and for this, they'd have to focus. And the Biden administration, I'm sorry to say, despite having great ideas, hasn't been able to pursue them with strength. And as Jonathan was saying, that is at the root of some of this weird sympathy in the Arab world and in much of the world for a version of the U.S. government that puts muscle behind where its mouth is.
Right. Okay, of course, and I know you want to comment on this, but, obviously we just have to speak to the fact, of course, that this would essentially require more American funding, per se. We know that the policy amongst the Republican members of Trump's new government, for example, J.D. Vance, as vice president, very isolationist. They don't want to be putting a lot of money towards foreign issues. They want to focus on domestic policy. And also, generally, the sentiment is that why should the West be involved in our issues in the Middle East as a whole? But do you think the Lebanese feel that way anymore, given what's happening with Hezbollah?
I think the Lebanese are putting their, you can say, salvation towards Israel because they're hoping that Israel would finish the job that it started by hurting Hezbollah that much that they will not be able to achieve their military capabilities again, like they were able to do that in 2006 in the previous war.
Dan, just any comments on kind of what we can expect from, U.S. policy in Gaza post this election?
Well, in Gaza, as elsewhere in the region, we see a situation that is such a mess that it's unsustainable. And much of it comes from Iranian interference, whether it's supporting Hamas and Jihad, the Hezbollah disaster in Lebanon, the Houthis, now militias in Iraq that may fire at Israel. You mentioned before that Trump is, the Republicans are isolationists, and J.D. Vance is pushing in that direction. But I think there's a deal to be done where Trump almost certainly, if he comes to power, will sell out Ukraine. A little sadly for people who don't want Putin to receive a prize. In exchange for that humongous victory from their perspective, I think he'll get leeway to operate in the Middle East.
I mean, how could the outcome of the U.S. presidential elections impact these negotiations, and also what a post-war Gaza plan could look like? We know that obviously Trump, during his presidency, cut funding to the Palestinian Authority. And the question is, if he were to be elected, how could we expect him to essentially act on this?
So basically, I think we should look at it as a two-phase process. First, there is the period between today, effectively today, and January, when Biden is in office. He is effectively the president. He has all the powers of the executive office, and without the constraints that he was under in the last few weeks, which means that he can do significant things. The other thing to watch for is that the Saudi Arabia is leading effectively an effort to create an upgraded Arab peace initiative. So between Biden, who wants to leave a legacy, and the Saudis, who are leading this upgraded Arab peace initiative, Israel may face a situation over a 2-month period. This is a significant period in which there is a new vision that is being put forward for the day after Gaza. And that vision will be based on some principles that are very clear. That Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial unit, which is one of the founding principles of Oslo. That the Palestinian Authority will be the governing, reformed and upgraded, will be the governing body of Gaza. That the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians.
I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, giving us your insight. We'll see what happens tomorrow. I'm going to turn to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry. I know that you want to kind of respond to what we heard Gidi say there.
Well, I mean, I agree with every word he said, basically, and I just want to put an exclamation mark on the fundamental thing. Hamas should be removed from Gaza. For this to happen, there needs to be Arab world pressure like it's never existed before. When the Arab world is upset at the ongoing killing in Gaza, they need to look at Hamas. The killing can end in a second if the hostages are returned and if Hamas hands over the keys. But the problem is, who to? No one could get behind this plan. No one will put pressure on anyone unless Israel unblocks the blockage and says, yes, We want the PA to be returned to Gaza. The fact that Israel does not do this, does not say these words, that is the primary reason for the blockage of a series of events, one triggering the other, that could bring an end to the war. Now, you could say, well, we're at loggerheads because Hamas won't give up, but they won't face pressure to give up. And it will be a forever war unless Israel presents, not a vision is too big a word, agrees to the only obvious outlet, which is the PA reformed, improved, maybe under different leadership, with Israel and the US assisting and guiding and maybe limiting what can happen, but the PA returning to Gaza. This is the be-all and end-all, the beginning point of any plan that leads to an end to the war. So whereas I've been calling on Qatar and Egypt to pressure Hamas, and I would love to see the US go to Tehran and lay down the law with the proxies and the nuclear program and all the rest of it, a lot of pressure needs to be brought to bear on Netanyahu, who is absolutely preventing any progress here by refusing to talk about a day after in Gaza, demonizing the PA in a way that is reckless, considering that whatever peace there is in the West Bank, and there is a version of peace in the West Bank, is due to the PA. It's an outrage. And to think that this is happening because of coalition considerations, and who knows, the government might fall if the extreme right makes good on what may be a bluff to bring down the government if they should say the words PA. People are dying for the government to somehow survive another day. This is immoral. It's an abomination. It's unstrategic. It's downright stupid. And if we embark down this path, the end point of it, I believe, under Biden and Harris and Trump, would be normalization with Saudi Arabia and the aforementioned grand design with a strategic alliance, including the West, arrayed against Iran. So Israel's leaving a lot of money on the table to satisfy the extreme right in the coalition.
Top American and Saudi officials have reportedly held talks in Washington about a possible security agreement that would not end up normalizing ties between the kingdom and Israel. A peace deal has really been all but shelved amid the ongoing Gaza war, with the current Israeli government refusing to even discuss the possibility of a future Palestinian state. And I'd like to turn to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry, on this. I mean, what would this essentially mean for Israel if the U.S. and Saudi Arabia were to sign security deals right now without Israel's involvement, or at least future plans with Israel being considered?
The deal wouldn't be against Israel. The deal would be in favor of Saudi Arabia, and it would, again, be a sort of signal to Iran. So I think Israel would maybe see itself as a member in waiting of this arrangement. But if Saudi got the deal without having to pay anything in the currency of normalization with Israel, that may disincentivize them to then go for that. Because Saudi Arabia basically wants to deal with the U.S., and the normalization was meant to be the price they pay. I think it would kind of be unfortunate for the Saudi Arabians for the U.S. to give them that before they can extract the grander alliance. But if that happens, again, it's not bad, but it's not less good than it could have been. It would be yet another price that Israel's paid for its inability to put together anything resembling a strategic program for the region and for itself.
Dan Perry here. Everyone is on the edge of their seat in Israel, across the Middle East, obviously in the United States. I want your final prediction as to who you think is going to win tonight, and whether or not you think that candidate will be better or worse for the state of Israel.
I can't predict who's going to win. I mean, I don't even believe the polls, because the polls are jacking up Trump's support to account for the fact that they previously undercounted his support. So I'm not even sure it'll be that close. We just don't know. My only predictions are basically that if Trump loses, he won't concede and he'll fight it in court. And if Trump wins, then there's big trouble for Ukraine and for Volodymyr Zelensky. But look, this is a very, very exciting election. Whichever way it goes, either we have the first woman president, who's also the first president in a long time who never won a party primary. And it's quite exciting, not to mention a second president who isn't white. If Trump wins, we have the delayed re-election of a convicted felon who's twice impeached and who says he loves dictators and wants to be one. It's beyond belief interesting. Now, there's a lot of trepidation domestically about what Trump would bring if he wins. But the really interesting story, I think, is international. If you look at U.S. history, There hasn't been a discernible difference between the two parties overall. There's been sort of a global consensus, some even call it the global liberal consensus, between the two parties since World War II. The institutions that the U.S. helped build, from NATO to the IMF to the World Health Organization, that basically kept the peace and maintained prosperity. Everyone supported this from both sides. Even on the Vietnam War, the two parties weren't that far apart. Incredible. Now, there really is a difference on foreign policy also. And it's rather amazing. We mentioned Ukraine. That is binary. If Trump wins, that whole narrative changes, and Putin is going to be rewarded, and a lot of people are right to be concerned about that. But on the Middle East, as we said, he's so capricious and unpredictable that who knows what will happen. And I think the Israeli right wing is celebrating a bit too soon, but then again, they may be right, of course, because Trump doesn't care about the Palestinians. But the real issue is, I think, the edifice of nonsense and chaos in the Middle East has become so profound, so implausible, and so unsustainable that even though I personally can find little to celebrate in the Trump re-election, I do admit that the idea of someone coming in and potentially breaking heads will have appeal to people across the board in creating some surprising allies between a lot of people in Israel who see that the current situation is going nowhere, and Lebanese who want someone to lay down the law with Iran in order to get rid of Hezbollah at long last. So no matter what, this skepticism and the cynicism that we're all the same and everything, nothing matters, and all politicians are the same somehow, is wrong, because this has impact, and it's genuinely fascinating.
I agree. It is absolutely fascinating.